The millionaire was stunned to see the love of his youth selling flowers on the street. He thought she had died 40 years ago, and what he discovered left him breathless. Ethan Bradley sat alone at his favorite table in the corner of the bustling coffee shop, a space he had claimed for years without competition. The waitstaff knew better than to ask if he needed anything else. His order, a black coffee, no sugar, always sat untouched until it was lukewarm. Outside, the city pulsed with energy, taxis honking, pedestrians rushing, and laughter echoing faintly through the streets. Inside, the warmth of the cafe felt worlds away from the icy quiet that had long claimed Ethan's soul. At 67, Ethan's life looked enviable from the outside. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his tailored suit bespoke his wealth, and his sharp blue eyes hinted at a life of hard-earned success. Yet those eyes carried an unmistakable emptiness, as though they'd spent decades gazing at something long out of reach. For all his material accomplishments, a sprawling Manhattan penthouse, an art collection worth millions, and the respect of the city's elite, Ethan's existence had become a shell. He folded his hands over the coffee cup, staring at his reflection in the dark liquid. His thoughts drifted back, as they so often did, to Sarah. Her name had become a whisper in his mind, a bittersweet melody he hummed to himself on lonely nights. He hadn't spoken her name aloud in decades. Sarah Whitmore. He could still see her clearly, despite the passage of 40 years. Her auburn curls, her mischievous smile, and the way her green eyes lit up when she laughed. She had been his first love, the kind that burned brightly, fiercely, with no regard for time or consequence. Sarah had been his entire world, and for a brief, shimmering moment, they had dreamed of a life together. But dreams had a way of shattering. Ethan's grip tightened on the coffee cup as he recalled that night. The phone call had come late, his father's voice somber as he relayed the news. Sarah had been in a car accident, and she hadn't survived. It was a stormy night, his father had said, and the roads had been slick with rain. Ethan had never questioned the story. Why would he? His father had always been a man of precision, the kind who measured his words carefully. The weight of her loss never left him. Over the years, Ethan tried to fill the void with work, wealth, and a series of meaningless relationships, but none of it healed the wound. The ache remained, a constant companion that shadowed every decision, every accomplishment. Today, like so many other days, her memory followed him out of the coffee shop and into the bustling city streets. He walked aimlessly, his thoughts a swirl of what-ifs and regrets. He turned a corner and paused, his eyes catching on something that pulled him out of his reverie, a flower stand tucked against the side of a building. It wasn't the flowers that stopped him, it was the woman tending the stand. She was in her early 60s, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a loose bun. She wore a simple wool coat and gloves, her hands busy arranging a bouquet of roses. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he stared at her face. It was impossible, yet undeniable. She looked just like Sarah. Ethan stood frozen, his heart thudding in his chest. The resemblance was uncanny, but no, it couldn't be her. Sarah had been gone for decades. He reminded himself of this, yet his feet seemed unwilling to move. He found himself walking toward the stand, drawn by an inexplicable pull. "Would you like to buy a rose?" the woman asked, her voice soft-warm. She held up a single red bloom, her lips curving into a gentle smile. Ethan's eyes searched hers, looking for something, anything that might explain what he was seeing. Her voice, though kind, carried no hint of recognition. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. The woman hesitated, then smiled again. "Gabrielle," she said simply. "And you?" "Ethan," he replied, though the name felt foreign in his mouth. Gabrielle tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. For a moment, something flickered in her expression, curiosity, perhaps, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "A rose for you, Ethan," she said, pressing the flower gently into his hand. Ethan nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He turned and walked away, the rose clutched in his hand like a lifeline. His heart pounded with questions he didn't know how to ask. Was this just a cruel coincidence, or was it something more? The city blurred around him as he walked, his mind spinning. The woman at the flower stand might not have recognized him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he knew her. Or at least, he had known her once, long before the years had stolen so much from them both. When Ethan finally returned to his penthouse, he set the rose in a crystal vase on his desk. It stood there, vibrant reminder of the impossible. And for the first time in decades, Ethan found himself daring to hope. Ethan couldn't sleep that night. The image of Gabrielle, her face, her voice, the familiar warmth in her smile, played on an endless loop in his mind. The resemblance to Sarah was undeniable, yet the impossibility of it gnawed at him. Could it really be her? And if it was, why didn't she recognize him? The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the towering windows of his penthouse, Ethan sat at his desk, staring at the rose and the crystal vase. He had spent his entire life avoiding questions about the past, locking his grief away like a secret too painful to confront. But now, with Gabrielle occupying every corner of his thoughts, he knew he couldn't leave this unanswered. He picked up his phone and dialed the number of someone he hadn't called in years. "David, it's Ethan Bradley," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "I need a favor." David Malone had been Ethan's private investigator for decades, handling everything from background checks to discreet inquiries into business rivals. But this was different. This wasn't business. "Of course, Mr. Bradley," David replied smoothly. "What do you need?" Ethan hesitated, unsure how to explain. "There's a woman," he began slowly. "She works at a flower stand downtown. Her name is Gabrielle, and I need you to find out everything you can about her." David didn't ask questions. He never did. "I'll look into it. Give me a few days." The days that followed were agonizingly slow. Ethan returned to the flower stand twice, hoping to find Gabrielle there again, but both times the stand was closed. Each failed attempt left him more restless. He tried to focus on work, attending meetings and reviewing reports, but his mind kept wandering back to her. Finally, on the fourth evening, David called with his findings. "I managed to dig up some information," David said. "Gabrielle Moore, 63 years old. She's been working at that flower stand for the past 15 years. Before that, she lived in a small town in upstate New York. No criminal record, no major red flags. But here's the strange part. There's no record of her existence before 1983. Ethan's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I mean there's nothing, no birth certificate, no school records, no medical history. It's like she appeared out of nowhere." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. Could she have changed her identity? "It's possible," David admitted. "Witness protection, maybe? Or a memory issue. There's a note in her employment history that she suffered from amnesia years ago. No details, just that it happened." Amnesia. The word hit Ethan like a thunderclap. He gripped the phone tighter. "And there's no family? No next of kin?" "Not that I could find," David said. "If she has any family, they're not in her official records." Ethan sat in silence, his mind racing. Amnesia. Could that explain why she didn't recognize him? And if she truly was Sarah, what had happened to her all those years ago? "There's one more thing," David added hesitantly. "I looked into the car accident you mentioned from 40 years ago. The one that killed Sarah Whitmore." Ethan's stomach tightened. "And the official report says her car went off a bridge during a storm. Her body was never recovered." Ethan's blood ran cold. He had always accepted his father's account of the accident, never questioning the details. But now, with this new information, doubt crept in. Could it be possible that Sarah hadn't died that night? "David," Ethan said, his voice low but firm, "I need you to keep digging. If there's even a chance that Gabrielle is Sarah, I need to know the truth." That night, Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of memories and questions. He pulled out an old photo album from the back of his closet, one he hadn't opened in decades. Inside were snapshots of a life that felt like a dream. Sarah laughing on the beach, Sarah sketching in her notebook, Sarah holding his hand at the fair. He lingered on one photo in particular, a candid shot of her sitting on the hood of his old convertible, her auburn curls glowing in the sunlight. He compared it to the image of Gabrielle in his mind. The similarities were striking, but there was something else, something deeper. The way Gabrielle had smiled at him felt so familiar, like an echo of the past. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the photo resting in his lap. He had spent 40 years grieving a woman he thought he had lost forever. But now, for the first time, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades: hope. A week later, David called again. This time, his voice carried an urgency that made Ethan sit up straight. "I found something," David said. "It's not definitive, but it's significant. Gabrielle was admitted to a hospital in Albany in 1983, found unconscious by the side of a highway. She had no ID, no memory, nothing. They called her Jane Doe for months until she started using the name Gabrielle. If she's Sarah, This might be the key to proving it. Ethan's hands trembled as he absorbed the information. Did you find anything else? David hesitated. Not yet. But there's more to this story. I'm sure of it. I'll keep looking. Ethan hung up and stared out the window, the city lights twinkling like stars. For 40 years, he had believed his story with Sarah had ended. Now he realized it might just be beginning. Ethan knew there was only one person who could provide answers about the events of 40 years ago, his father, Richard Bradley. Their relationship had always been strained, a quiet battlefield of unspoken accusations and unfulfilled expectations. Ethan had spent most of his life avoiding Richard, keeping their conversations polite but superficial. Now he had no choice but to confront the man who had shaped so much of his life and possibly destroyed it. The Bradley estate, a sprawling mansion on Long Island, loomed ahead as Ethan's driver pulled through the gates. Memories flooded back as he walked up the marble steps, each one more unwelcome than the last. This was where he had grown up, where his father had instilled in him the importance of power, reputation, and control. Love had never been part of Richard Bradley's vocabulary. Ethan found his father in the library, seated in a high-backed leather chair with a glass of scotch in hand. At 89, Richard's once imposing figure had shrunk, but his sharp gaze remained unyielding. He looked up as Ethan entered, his expression as unreadable as ever. "To what do I owe this rare visit?" Richard asked, his tone as cold as the room's dark mahogany walls. Ethan wasted no time. "I need to know the truth about Sarah Whitmore's accident," he said, standing firm despite the tightness in his chest. Richard's expression didn't change, but there was a brief flicker in his eyes, something Ethan couldn't quite place. "That was a long time ago, Ethan." "Why dig up the past?" "Because the past doesn't stay buried," Ethan said, his voice growing sharper. "I've spent 40 years believing she died that night. Now I find out her body was never recovered. And there's more, a woman in the city who looks exactly like her, a woman with no memory of who she was before 1983. Tell me what really happened, Dad." Richard swirled his scotch, his gaze fixed on the amber liquid. "You're chasing ghosts," he said finally. Ethan stepped closer, his fists clenched. "No more lies, Dad. Did you have anything to do with what happened to Sarah?" The room fell silent, the air heavy with tension. Richard sighed and set his glass down, the sound echoing in the stillness. "Fine. You want the truth?" "Yes, I was involved. But not in the way you think." Ethan's stomach dropped. He braced himself, not sure he was ready for what was coming. "I didn't plan the accident," Richard said, his tone measured. "But I knew it would happen. I hired someone to follow her that night, to scare her off, make her leave town. She was distracting you, Ethan, pulling you away from everything you were meant to achieve. I thought she'd realize she wasn't good enough for you and disappear." Ethan stared at his father, a wave of anger rising in his chest. "You hired someone to follow her," he said, his voice trembling. "And that person drove her off the road?" "I didn't want it to go that far," Richard snapped. "It wasn't supposed to end that way. But when the car went off the bridge, I'll let you believe she was gone. I thought it was for the best." "For the best?" Ethan shouted. "You destroyed both our lives. You robbed me of the only woman I ever loved." Richard's gaze didn't waver. "And look at what you've built without her. You think you'd be the man you are today if she'd stayed?" Ethan's hands trembled as he fought to contain his fury. "The man I am today," he said slowly, "is empty. And that's on you." Richard leaned back in his chair, his face hardening. "What do you want from me, Ethan? Regret? Apologies? What's done is done." Ethan stepped away, his heart pounding. "What's done can't be undone," he said. "But I'm not letting you destroy anything else. You'll stay out of this, Dad. I'll find the truth myself." As Ethan stormed out of the library, his father's voice followed him. "You're chasing a memory, Ethan. Be careful it doesn't destroy you." Ethan didn't look back. For the first time in years, he felt alive, not with hope, but with purpose. If Richard had lied about Sarah's death, what else had he hidden? Ethan was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The revelation from Richard left Ethan reeling. His father's actions had shaped his life in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. But one thing was clear, Sarah's story hadn't ended that stormy night. Ethan needed answers, and he was determined to find them. David's investigation had already provided a lead, Gabrielle's admission to the hospital in Albany after the accident. It was the missing piece that connected Sarah to her new identity. Ethan decided to visit Albany himself, hoping to uncover more about the woman who might be his lost love. The drive upstate was long, the autumn landscape a blur of fiery reds and golden yellows. Ethan's mind churned with questions. How had Sarah survived the crash? Why hadn't she contacted him? And if she truly was Gabrielle, how had she built a life so far removed from the one they'd planned together? When he arrived at Albany General Hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic greeted him as he walked through the doors. A friendly receptionist directed him to the records office, where he met with a middle-aged clerk named Linda. "I'm looking for information on a patient admitted here in 1983, Ethan said, sliding a note with Gabrielle's name and details across the desk. Her name was listed as Jane Doe at the time. Linda raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "We'll see what we can find." Minutes later, she returned with a thin file. "Here it is. She was brought in after being found by the side of a highway. Severe head trauma, no ID. It says here she had amnesia, complete memory loss." Ethan's chest tightened as he scanned the file. Gabrielle's injuries matched what he imagined Sarah might have endured: a concussion, broken ribs, and lacerations consistent with a car accident. There was even a note about her waking up disoriented, unable to recall her name or her past. "Did anyone come looking for her?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Linda shook her head. "Not according to this. She stayed here for a few months before being transferred to a rehabilitation center. After that, it looks like she started a new life as Gabrielle Moore." Ethan thanked Linda and left the hospital, his mind racing. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but so many questions remained. If Sarah had survived, why hadn't anyone searched for her? And what role had his father played in ensuring she never returned to him? Back in Manhattan, Ethan stood across the street from the flower stand, watching Gabrielle work. She moved with a quiet grace, arranging bouquets and chatting with customers. The life she had built was simple, unremarkable, yet it suited her. It was hard to reconcile this woman with the vibrant, ambitious Sarah he had once known. Summoning his courage, Ethan crossed the street. Gabrielle looked up as he approached, her warm smile the same as before. "Back again?" she asked, holding up a bouquet of daisies. "You must really love flowers." Ethan chuckled softly. "It's not the flowers I keep coming back for." Gabrielle tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What brings you here, then?" Ethan hesitated. He wanted to tell her everything, to confess that he believed she was Sarah, the woman he had loved and lost. But he couldn't rush this. If she truly had no memory of her past, he needed to tread carefully. "Just trying to understand something," he said finally. Gabrielle studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled again. "Well, if you ever figure it out, let me know." Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. He couldn't force her to remember, but he could give her the chance to rediscover the life that had been stolen from her. Ethan returned to the flower stand every day for the next week, each visit a cautious step forward. Gabrielle, as always, greeted him with the same warm smile and polite conversation. Though she remained unaware of their shared past, Ethan couldn't help but notice small details that reminded him of Sarah. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she concentrated, the gentle hum of a tune as she worked, and the way her laughter had the same musical quality that haunted his dreams. He resisted the urge to overwhelm her with questions or declarations. Instead, he focused on building a connection, offering to help her carry boxes of flowers, sharing stories of the city, and occasionally buying roses, which he kept in his penthouse as a reminder of the impossible hope that now fueled him. One crisp morning, as the leaves began to scatter across the sidewalks, Ethan approached the stand with a purpose. This time he carried something with him, a small, framed photograph of Sarah. It was taken the summer before the accident, during a weekend trip to the lake. She was smiling at the camera, barefoot in the grass, holding a paintbrush in one hand and a half-finished canvas in the other. "Gabrielle," he said, his voice steady but soft, "can I show you something?" She glanced up from a bouquet she was arranging, her expression curious. "Of course." Ethan handed her the photo, watching her reaction closely. Gabrielle's brow furrowed as she studied the image. She hesitated, running her fingers lightly over the edges of the frame. "This is beautiful. She looks familiar somehow." Ethan's heart pounded. "Do you recognize her?" Gabrielle shook her head slowly, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, an emotion she couldn't quite place. "I don't know. It's strange. I feel like I should." Ethan's breath caught. It wasn't a confirmation, but it was something. Her name was Sarah, he said carefully. She was an artist. She loved painting outdoors, just like in this photo. Gabrielle smiled faintly. It's a lovely memory. Were you close? Ethan's throat tightened. He hadn't prepared for this question, for how it would feel to explain their connection. We were very close, he said finally. She meant everything to me. Gabrielle looked at him with a kindness that made his chest ache. I can tell. The way you speak about her, you must have loved her very much. Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. I did. Before he could say more, a customer approached, breaking the moment. Gabrielle turned her attention back to the stand, her usual cheerful demeanor returning as she assisted them. Ethan stepped back, the weight of the conversation settling over him. That evening, Ethan sat in his study, staring at the photograph of Sarah on his desk. He had seen a spark in Gabrielle's eyes, a flicker of recognition that couldn't be ignored. But was it enough? Could memories buried so deeply ever resurface? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing. It was David. I've got an update, David said. I tracked down someone who might be able to help, a nurse who worked at the hospital where Gabrielle was treated. Her name's Margaret Olson. She was involved in Gabrielle's recovery back in 1983 and remembers the case vividly. She's retired now, but she agreed to meet with you. Ethan felt a surge of hope. When? Tomorrow. She's expecting you at her home in Queens. Ethan thanked David and ended the call, his mind racing. Margaret might hold the key to unlocking Gabrielle's past. And if she did, it could bring him one step closer to proving what he already felt in his heart. Gabrielle was Sarah. The next morning, Ethan drove to Queens, the city gradually giving way to quieter neighborhoods. Margaret's house was modest but well kept, with a small garden blooming in the front yard. She greeted him at the door, her kind eyes and gentle demeanor putting him at ease. Mr. Bradley, she said, ushering him inside. David told me a little about why you're here. You're asking about Gabrielle Moore. Yes, Ethan replied. I believe she may have been someone I lost a long time ago. Someone named Sarah Whitmore. Margaret nodded slowly. I remember Gabrielle well. She was a mystery when she came to us. No name, no family, no memory of who she was. She was quiet, but there was a strength in her. She worked hard in therapy, determined to rebuild her life, even without knowing where she came from. Ethan leaned forward. Did she ever recover any memories? Anything at all? Margaret shook her head. Not while I knew her. But there was one thing, she loved to paint. Even before she could walk properly again, she'd sit by the window and paint for hours. She said it felt natural, like something she'd always done. Ethan's breath caught. Sarah had been an artist, too. It was another piece of the puzzle, fitting perfectly into place. She kept one of her paintings, Margaret added, standing to retrieve something from a nearby shelf. She said it was the first thing she created after the accident. Margaret handed Ethan a small canvas. It was a simple landscape, rolling hills and a lone tree under a golden sky. But Ethan recognized it immediately. It was the view from their favorite spot by the lake. Ethan sat in his car outside Margaret Olson's home, the small canvas resting in his lap. His hands traced the edges of the painting, his mind replaying every moment he had spent with Sarah at that lakeside spot. She had always called it their sanctuary, a place where the world felt quiet and infinite. And now here it was, painted by a woman who had no memory of her past but somehow recreated this exact scene. If there had been any lingering doubt in Ethan's mind, it was gone. Gabrielle was Sarah. Returning to Manhattan, Ethan knew he couldn't keep circling the truth. He needed to show Gabrielle this painting to see if it would stir something within her. It was time to give her the chance to remember. The following morning, Ethan stood at the flower stand, the canvas carefully wrapped in brown paper under his arm. Gabrielle was arranging bouquets, her fingers deftly weaving stems and ribbons together. She looked up and smiled as he approached. Good morning, Ethan, she said warmly. You're becoming my best customer. Ethan chuckled, though his heart was pounding. I promise I'm not here to buy up all your flowers today, he said. But I do have something I'd like to show you. Curiosity flickered in her eyes. What is it? He unwrapped the canvas, holding it out to her. Gabrielle's hands trembled slightly as she took it, her gaze locking onto the painting. For a moment, she was silent, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words coming. This, she murmured, her voice barely audible. This feels familiar. Ethan stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "It's a place," he said softly. "A place you once loved. Do you remember it?" Gabrielle's brow furrowed, her fingers brushing over the painted hills. "I don't know," she whispered, but her voice wavered with emotion. "I feel like I've been here before, but I can't place it. It's like it's on the edge of my mind, just out of reach." Ethan's chest tightened. He could see the struggle in her eyes, the flickers of recognition battling with the fog of lost memory. "You painted this," he said gently, "years ago, after you survived the accident. I think this is more than a memory. It's a part of who you are." Gabrielle looked up at him, tears glistening in her eyes. "Ethan, why are you showing me this? What aren't you telling me?" Ethan took a deep breath, knowing he couldn't hold back any longer. "Because I think you're someone I lost a long time ago," he said. "Someone I thought was gone forever. I think you're Sarah Whitmore." Gabrielle blinked, stunned into silence. She shook her head slightly, as if trying to process his words. "Sarah Whitmore," she repeated, the name unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. "You had an accident 40 years ago," Ethan continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You lost your memory, and everyone thought you were gone. But you survived. You became Gabrielle. And now, somehow, we've found each other again." Gabrielle's hands gripped the edges of the painting, her breath shallow. This can't be real," she said, her voice breaking. "How can I be Sarah? I don't remember any of this." Ethan reached out, his hand hovering near hers. "I know it's overwhelming," he said gently, "but deep down, I think you do remember. Maybe not everything, but pieces. I see it in your eyes when you look at this painting." Tears spilled down Gabrielle's cheeks as she stared at the canvas. "I don't know who I am," she said, her voice trembling. "I've lived as Gabrielle for so long. I don't know if I can be anyone else." "You don't have to be anyone else," Ethan said softly. "You're still the same person, no matter what name you go by. And no matter what you remember, I'm here. I'll help you figure it out." For a long moment, Gabrielle didn't speak. She held the painting close, her tears falling silently. Finally, she looked at Ethan, her expression a mixture of fear, hope, and something else, something that felt like the faintest glimmer of recognition. "Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I want to try. I want to know who I really am." Ethan nodded, his own tears threatening to spill. "Then we'll figure it out together," he said. Gabrielle managed a small, tentative smile, and in that moment, Ethan felt the years of pain and loss begin to lift. There was still so much uncertainty ahead, but for the first time in decades, there was also hope. Over the next several weeks, Ethan and Gabrielle embarked on a journey to uncover the truth of her past. It wasn't an easy process. Gabrielle was hesitant, afraid of what they might discover, but Ethan's steady presence reassured her. He didn't push her to remember everything all at once. Instead, he gave her the space to process the possibility that she might be someone other than the woman she thought she had been for the past 40 years. Their first stop was the lake, the one from the painting. Gabrielle had agreed to go, though she was nervous. "What if I don't feel anything?" she had asked Ethan before they left. "Then that's okay," he had replied gently. "This isn't about forcing memories. It's about giving you a chance to reconnect with whatever feels familiar." As they arrived, Gabrielle stepped out of the car and took a deep breath. The autumn air was crisp, the trees ablaze with color, their reflections rippling in the clear water. Gabrielle stood still, her eyes scanning the landscape. "This is it, isn't it?" she said softly, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded, watching her closely. "It's where we used to come. We'd spend hours here, talking, laughing, dreaming about the future. You loved painting here. It was your favorite spot." Gabrielle walked toward the edge of the lake, her steps slow and deliberate. She knelt in the grass, running her fingers over the earth as if trying to anchor herself to something buried deep within her. "I feel something," she whispered. "It's not a memory exactly, but it's like a shadow, a feeling I can't quite name." Ethan crouched beside her, his voice gentle. "That's enough," he said. "Feelings are where it starts." Gabrielle smiled faintly, though her expression remained pensive. "Do you think it's possible to truly forget someone you loved?" Ethan's chest tightened. "No," he said quietly. "Not really. Even if the details fade, the love stays. It's part of who you are, whether you remember it or not." Gabrielle nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Then maybe it's still in me somewhere. I just need time to find it. Their next stop was the rehabilitation center where Gabrielle had spent months recovering after the accident. The building was now a senior care facility, but Margaret had provided the name of a former therapist who had worked with Gabrielle during her recovery. Dr. Helen Carter was in her 80s, but her mind was sharp and her memory even sharper. She greeted Ethan and Gabrielle in her small apartment, her eyes lighting up as she took in Gabrielle's face. "I remember you," Dr. Carter said with a smile. "Gabrielle, or at least that's what we started calling you. You were quiet but determined, always asking when you'd start remembering things again." Gabrielle shifted nervously in her chair. "Did I ever remember anything?" Dr. Carter's smile faded slightly. "Not much, I'm afraid. You had flashes now and then, dreams about places, faces you couldn't name, but you never fully regained your memory. Still, you found a way to move forward. You created a new life for yourself, and I always admired your strength." Gabrielle nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Did I ever mention a lake? Or painting?" Dr. Carter tilted her head, thinking. "You did mention painting," she said. "It seemed to bring you comfort, even when everything else felt so uncertain. I remember you once painted a landscape. It was very vivid. You said you didn't know where it came from, but it felt important." Gabrielle glanced at Ethan, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "The painting," she murmured. Ethan reached out, placing a hand over hers. "It's a thread," he said. "We'll keep pulling it." As they left the apartment, Gabrielle turned to Ethan, her face a mix of emotions. "It's strange," she said, "hearing her talk about me like I'm someone else. Gabrielle, Sarah, it's like I'm caught between two lives, and I don't know which one is real." Ethan stopped walking, turning to face her. "They're both real," he said firmly. "You're not one or the other, you're both. Gabrielle is the woman you became after the accident. Sarah is the woman you were before. But at your core, you're still you. The person I fell in love with is still here." Gabrielle's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, her voice trembling. "What if I can't remember, Ethan? What if I never truly know who I am?" Ethan reached out, gently tilting her chin so she faced him. "Then we make new memories," he said. "Together. The past doesn't define who you are. It's what we do now that matters." For the first time in weeks, Gabrielle smiled, a real, unguarded smile. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not giving up on me." Ethan smiled back, his heart swelling with a mix of love and relief. "I never could," he said. As they walked back to the car, hand in hand, Ethan felt a renewed sense of hope. They were piecing the puzzle together, one fragment at a time. And while the road ahead was uncertain, it was a road they would travel together. Winter arrived quietly, blanketing the city in a soft, white glow. Gabrielle's flower stand had closed for the season, and she spent her days painting in a small studio Ethan had helped her set up. She claimed it wasn't much, a few canvases, some brushes, and paints, but to Ethan, it was the first tangible sign that she was beginning to rediscover herself. Her paintings had grown bolder over the weeks. At first, they were abstract, filled with muted tones and swirling forms. But as the days passed, they began to take on a new clarity. A familiar lakeside scene emerged on one canvas. On another, a pair of hands intertwined beneath a canopy of stars. "I don't know where these images come from," Gabrielle had confessed one evening, wiping paint from her hands. "They just feel like they belong to me." "They do," Ethan had said simply, his voice filled with quiet conviction. As Christmas approached, Ethan invited Gabrielle to his penthouse for dinner. It was a quiet evening, just the two of them, the city lights twinkling below like a sea of stars. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the scent of rosemary and roasted vegetables filled the air. Gabrielle wandered through the space, her fingers grazing the edges of the bookshelves and framed photographs. She paused in front of a small photo of a young Ethan and Sarah, taken at a 4th of July picnic. "This was her, wasn't it?" Gabrielle asked, picking up the frame. Ethan stood beside her, his hands in his pockets. "Yes," he said. "That was us. We just started talking about leaving our little town, moving to the city. We had so many plans." Gabrielle stared at the photo for a long time, her expression unreadable. Finally, she placed it back on the shelf and turned to him. "Do you ever wish you could go back? Change things?" Ethan met her gaze, his voice steady. "I used to. For years, all I could think about was what I'd lost. But now, I think everything that happened brought us back here. To this moment, Gabrielle nodded, her eyes shimmering. "You're sure I'm her?" she whispered. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Ethan replied. Gabrielle took a deep breath, then reached for his hand. "Then I think it's time I stopped running from it." The following week, Ethan took Gabrielle to visit a small art gallery in Brooklyn. She had no idea why they were there until they walked into a private room where a single painting hung on the wall, her first piece from the rehabilitation center, the golden-hued landscape with a lone tree. Gabrielle gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "I painted this," she said, her voice trembling. "You did," Ethan said, smiling. "Margaret kept it all these years. She said it was the first time she saw hope in your eyes after the accident." Gabrielle stepped closer to the painting, tears streaming down her face. Memories began to flood her mind, not fully formed, but flashes, glimpses of a life she had once lived. The sound of laughter, the warmth of a hand in hers, the scent of pine trees by the lake. "Ethan," she said, her voice breaking. "I remember the lake. I remember us." Ethan stepped beside her, his heart pounding. "You do." She nodded, turning to him with a tearful smile. "It's not everything, but it's there. Like a door that's been locked for so long is finally starting to open." Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as emotion overwhelmed them both. "That's all that matters," he whispered. "We'll unlock it together, one step at a time." Over the next months, Gabrielle continued to piece together fragments of her past while embracing the life she had built as Gabrielle. She began exhibiting her work in small galleries, her paintings celebrated for their raw emotion and beauty. Ethan was by her side through it all, her unwavering supporter and partner. One crisp spring morning, they returned to the lake, this time with Gabrielle's easel and paints. As she worked, Ethan sat nearby, watching her with a contented smile. "What are you painting today?" he asked. Gabrielle tilted her head, considering her canvas. "A new beginning," she said with a playful smile. When she finished, she stepped back to reveal her work. It was a vibrant depiction of the lake, but with a twist. In the foreground, two figures stood hand in hand, their faces turned toward the golden horizon. Ethan moved beside her, his voice soft. "It's beautiful." Gabrielle looked up at him, her eyes filled with love. "It's us," she said simply. He took her hand, squeezing it gently. "It always has been," he replied. As they stood together, the past and present finally merged into something whole. Gabrielle wasn't just Sarah, and she wasn't just Gabrielle. She was both, a woman who had faced unimaginable loss but found her way back to love, courage, and hope. And for Ethan, the years of emptiness had been worth it, because they had led him here to this moment, to her. The camera fades out as they walk toward the horizon, hand in hand, the lake shimmering behind them, a sanctuary reclaimed.